Good afternoon. I'm Kenneth, General Counsel of the Wallace Foundation. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Unpacking the Federal Response to COVID-19 in Education. What's in the CARES Act and what may come next? Our hope is that you leave this session today with three things: a better understanding of the CARES Act, a sense of how it is being used, and a glimpse of what might be ahead, understanding that none of us has a crystal ball. Today's webinar will be recorded and the slides will be posted on Wallace's website. Before I introduce our two speakers, let me share a word of background. The Wallace Foundation is an independent, endowed charitable foundation with a mission to improve the lives of marginalized children and strengthen the vitality of the arts. We work to develop credible evidence of solutions to pressing problems in the areas in which we work, including education leadership, summer learning, social and emotional learning, after school, and the arts. We share what we learn through our website, conference presentation, which is now virtual, social media, and other means. To provide opportunities for policymakers across both sides of the aisle to hear about these lessons, we've had the pleasure of working with EducationCounsel for 6 years. Today, we're very pleased that EducationCounsel has agreed to share their reflections on the CARES Act, building on the extraordinary popularity of their blog post, which has been viewed more than 10,000 times. Count them, 10,000 times. And I'm sure it's probably increased just today. There is also a broader purpose here. We live in very challenging times. The pandemic, like others that have swept through the world over the past centuries, has created huge challenges. As the scholar Frank Snowden, author of Epidemics in Society, has observed, throughout history, pandemics serve like looking glasses that reveal society's flaws and their commitment. Today's pandemic, COVID-19, has exposed and worsened the impact of pre-existing inequities in our economy and in education. For example, in access to digital learning. On top of the pandemic, we have also been witnesses to the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other people of color at the hands of the police, and this has ignited a broader national conversation about racial justice. All of this means the pressure on schools, on those running after school and summer learning programs, is great. To respond effectively, these institutions will need all the resources they can get, including at the federal level from the CARES Act. And that begins with an understanding of the landscape. To help us make sense of this landscape, I'm pleased to introduce our two speakers. Scott Palmer is Managing Director and co-founder of EducationCounsel, where he provides policy, legal, strategic planning, and advocacy services to education leaders on state and national policy matters. He has worked on a variety of major reforms, including college and career readiness, birth to 5 early learning systems, and promoting access and diversity in higher education. Scott was previously Deputy Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education, an attorney and policy advisor in the Clinton White House, where he worked on the president's race initiative on education and other civil rights issues. He holds a JD degree from the University of California, Berkeley Boalt Hall School of Law, a master's in public policy from Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, and a Bachelor of Arts with honors from the University of Maryland. Scott Worley is a senior policy associate at EducationCounsel. And prior to joining the firm, Sean worked as a high school science teacher and instructional coach with DC Public Schools. Sean began his career in education as a Teach for America Corps member in Sacramento, California. Sean has also served as an intern with the House Committee on Education and Workforce, where he worked extensively on monitoring state implementation of the Every Student Succeeds Act. Sean earned a master's in education policy and leadership from American University and earned a bachelor's in psychology with a minor in health care ethics from St. Louis University. Scott and Sean will speak for about an hour with a pause in the middle for your questions and leaving 15 minutes at the end for questions and conversation. Please feel free to use the chat box to pose your questions anytime. You'll see there's a chat box feature, and then there's a Q&A feature as well. And with that, I turn it over to Scott Palmer.
Thank you, Kenneth, and thank you for your leadership and that of the Wallace Foundation. Thanks for everyone for taking the time to join today. We hope that this is helpful. We're going to get pretty quickly into the weeds of federal legislation, both present CARES Act and what might come next. But before we do, we wanted to start at a broader level and build off some of the comments that Kenneth offered. We would say at the broadest level that we're at a really important inflection point as a nation in defining our education agenda and what we need to do to advance the far greater equity and outcomes that we need. The good news is there's a lot we know from the science of learning and development and otherwise about what it would take to really meet the potential of each and every child. But it will take great knowledge and will and leadership and capacity. And at the moment, as Kenneth said, we're faced with a number of overlapping crises. The COVID crisis, which has quickly shown the inadequacies and inequities in our systems and has literally closed schools down around the country. Instances of ongoing racial injustice and the hopeful movement for change, a worsening economic recession. It is a very difficult and overlapping series of circumstances. And yet we would hold out that in addition to the need to rise to that moment, there is also an opportunity in these crises to think about the long-term changes and transformations we need and what it would take to, for lack of a better term, build back better. So as we think about this, deep conversation, I hope we'll hold in check this broader notion of where do we need to and want to go in education. And today, in a sense, we're talking about the federal role in three dimensions. One is we'll go deep into the initial federal response in the form of the CARES Act, which was really a response to the initial COVID crisis. And we'll go deep on that and then talk a little bit about what the federal role might be in the recovery that is coming next and how long that recovery will take and what level of investment is, of course, an open issue. And finally, keeping in mind what might be the federal role overall, particularly in what, among other things, is a presidential election year and all the complications that arises from that. So with that, we're going to move quickly through some slides. We'll pause at various points for Q&A and hope that this will be useful. And I'll turn it over to Sean to lead us forward.
Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to some. To build off of what Kenneth and Scott have laid out for us, and before we dive into the details of the CARES Act and other efforts to respond to the pandemic, we just wanted to take a few moments to really lay the landscape of really the crisis that we're facing and the changes that the pandemic has caused for the education landscape, as well as the revelation of known inequities across our education systems and the challenges that we knew existed, but also now have an obligation to pay greater attention to. So when we think about the pandemic, when this started, when the national emergency was declared on March 13th, as the weeks went by, the pandemic ultimately caused 97% of schools to be closed across the country. The chart you see here indicates that in every state we see school closures, some that were directly mandated by the state, others that were left up to the decision of the district, or some were just recommended by various leadership. But ultimately, again, we saw 97% of schools closed last academic year due to the pandemic. That then led to a number of challenges for districts and a really high degree of variation for districts and their ability to pivot and support their students and their communities while they finish the school year. We're thinking really the focus of the fall or the spring was how schools can implement remote learning and distance learning programs to students. And for districts and largely high income districts that had that existing infrastructure, they were able to quickly pivot to those programs. But for lower income districts, we really saw a number of challenges that existed for schools and for districts to support their students. What's not captured in this map here is also the impacts that the pandemic has had on the childcare industry. And we know there's a very close relationship between childcare and K-12 education from both a education perspective, but also a workforce perspective. And currently the childcare industry, because of the pandemic, stands to lose as much as 50% of their infrastructure and their capacity. Not only does that translate to a number of jobs lost for childcare providers, but it also translates to thousands of slots for children to access childcare across the country. Thinking about what the industry is going to need in order to respond to the pandemic and to quantify this a little bit, the industry has projected that they need close to $9.6 billion per month to meet the needs of the children and the providers in order to move this forward. So when we think about the CARES Act and the continued response by the federal government, but also the implementation of response efforts by local government, to keep in mind the really diversity of needs that this pandemic has caused. Thinking again, going back to that point about digital learning and remote learning and the access to technology, some research out of the Education Week has found that students' access to devices in order to access remote learning opportunities was really dependent on the concentration of poverty within a school district. Not surprising, students that attended higher income districts were going to have more access to devices compared to students in lower income districts, as well as we then think about even for when having access to a device, there wasn't necessarily that true one-to-one ratio that we often think about with device access. In that I mean that students that were from low-income backgrounds were more likely that they needed to share a device with a family member so that they could either access their own remote learning or even for family members to access any other digital needs that were required in this moment. And so that's going to continue to be a challenge and continuing to be a conversation as governors start responding, as districts start responding, and again, as the federal government continues to think about how they can support response efforts as well. Just to make this a little bit more clear as we think about the CARES Act itself, beyond the educational needs, the pandemic has really had this impact on all states from a budget perspective. Data shows here that it compares the current pandemic to the last two recessions that the country has gone through, and economists project that for this pandemic, we're going to see upwards of $615 billion in budget shortfalls over the next 3 years. This compares to the Great Recession in 2008, where there was $690 billion, which is slightly higher, but that budget shortfall was spread over 5 years. We're currently looking at $615 billion spread over only 3 years. And we know, and we've learned from the Great Recession, that state budget shortfalls have a devastating impact on education budget, education programs, and those cuts are not felt equally across districts within a state. And so that's something that we'll also need to keep an eye on and consider as we think about additional relief efforts. Lastly, when we think about even looking to the fall and the situation that we're dealing with beyond the economic impacts, beyond the access to remote learning, is the expected learning loss that students are expected to have encountered because of the interruption in the spring. This data here from the NWEA illustrates that for math achievements, and we know that there's a typical summer slide, but for math achievement, because of the pandemic, we would expect students to be right around this point here, but with the impacts of the pandemic, we're actually looking for them to be significantly lower. And so when we think about even fall reopening, that there's not going to be this ability to go back to normal because students are coming from this incredibly lost learning situation that we had because of the pandemic. So when we think about what the major response has been from the federal government, at least, we oftentimes think about the CARES Act, or the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, which was passed in late March of this year. Overall, the bill included about $2 trillion in supports for businesses, governments, families, as well as education systems. But we're going to spend most of our time today thinking about the $30.75 billion that was included as part of the Education Stabilization Fund. And this has been the only federal relief effort that had education funding as part of it. And so we're going to be thinking about this right now in terms of current implementation, but as well as for future implementation as well. Beyond the economic benefits or the economic recovery aspects of the bill, the CARES Act also included some funding for early childhood education, which was critical given the needs that I outlined earlier. It also included some provisions for districts to waive various requirements under ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. This has largely been around assessment and accountability, so there were no statewide assessments that were administered last spring. There was support for nonprofits, and so that they could access some loans that were provided within the CARES Act, as well as some various higher education waivers. Additionally, the CARES Act included some financial flexibility for districts, and so that they could blend their existing funding with CARES Act funds to support kind of a comprehensive approach, as well as the ability to reserve some of their funding from last school year that may not have been able to be accessed because programs were significantly altered, and that was some needed flexibility as well. So right now we're at this phase of where funds are finally starting to have flowed to states, and we're starting to see some of that funding flow down to the district level, but that's definitely a very high level of variance across the country. When we think about relief to K through 12 education systems, we think about two main funds. There's the governor's relief funds, and then there's the K through 12 relief funds. For now, for the governor's relief funds, we have seen that all governors have access or applied for those fundings, and those fundings have been gone from the U.S. Department of Education to the states. Now, governors are currently in the process of developing their applications so that they can spend or provide those funds to either school districts or institutions of higher education. They are not required to do both. So those applications will be coming across from various states as well. For the K through 12 relief funds, we know all states applied for the relief funds, which means all states should have access to the relief fund. 90% of a state's funding for the K through 12 relief fund has to go to a school district. And school districts will ultimately have the choice and the authority for how they use those fundings. However, we're starting to hear that funds from states has not necessarily gone quickly to districts, and we're hearing reports as to states are trying to hold on to that so that they could get a better sense of their budget shortfalls, or trying to influence their districts and how they may use their funding so that there's a more collective, comprehensive approach throughout the state. But regardless, districts will have the authority to use and to choose how to spend those funds. It should also be noted that districts can use a number of funds for various purposes, including for after-school providers, but the funding will have to go to the district itself, and the district can then provide that funding to an after-school provider. I'm not going to dive deeply into this chart here, which was also included in our blog that was on the Wallace Foundation website, but this is just illustrate the high level of authority that a district has to choose how to spend their CARES funding, and they think about responding to the individual needs of their communities. But I did want to highlight a few, specifically that the CARES Act allows for districts to use funding that they receive to support any activities that are authorized by other federal education laws. So districts can use this funding for continued Title I purposes through ESSA. They can use it to support students with disabilities through IDEA, or even their career and technical programs through the Perkins Career and Technical Education Act. So there is the ability for districts to use this funding for existing programs. However, they're not limited to that. In fact, the CARES Act provides them a lot of flexibility in choosing how they can use those funds, including to address the unique needs of students that we know are disproportionately impacted by this pandemic, including students of color, students from low-income communities, English language learners, students with disabilities, students experiencing homelessness. So districts can choose to use their funding to attune to those unique needs of those students, which we know would be a very equitable use of those funding. Additionally, the CARES Act allows for districts to support school leaders, which we know is really critical, not only in a typical moment, but definitely in a crisis response, is that if school leaders are effective and school leaders are supported, that will have a benefit for the rest of the school community. And like I said, districts can use that funding for summer learning and after school programs. I should note, though, that with most districts not having received their funding, we're in the midst of summer, so it's unlikely that districts will be using their funds to support summer learning this summer. However, districts have until September of 2022 to use their funding. Now, we don't expect that districts are going to hold on to a majority of their funding for that long, but it does provide districts the opportunity to think ahead to next summer and and how they may use their CARES Act to support those programs. So funding does not have to be used until September 2022, which provides a much longer runway for districts to choose how to use their funding. So with all of that and all of the technical pieces, we wanted to take a moment to pause and to have you all drop any questions that you may have into the chat box. Scott and I will monitor this. We'll take a few moments to respond to some of those questions, and then we'll continue with the rest of the presentation when we think about current implementation of the CARES Act.
Thank you, Sean. As folks are additional questions into the chat, we've gotten a few already. Some of them are about what's the likelihood of future funding and flexibility, and if you don't mind, folks, we'll get into that in just a minute, so we'll try to address those as we turn to that part of the conversation. But as folks, again, feel free to add Q&A, and we'll try to track in this wonderful digital environment we're all in. Let me mention a couple of things that were asked that are already germane to Sean's comments. One question raised the point of the potential great need for support for summer and after school, and asked what are the supports that are available for that. Obviously, clear and express allowable use of the elementary and secondary funds, and of course also the governor's funds in the education context to support those uses. But there's also in the CARES Act several forgivable loan programs, including one for small businesses and not-for-profits that is also a separate entryway, at least for now, for nonprofits or small businesses to seek loans that can be forgiven, again, if they remain at certain employment levels and other things that I can't easily pull out the specific facts on in that area, but can provide more offline if helpful. Another question was about the state versus local flexibility, and if the districts have flexibility, what are the parameters and how can states seek to inform or direct use? It's actually a more complex question than you would think. The first thing I'll say is that there are obviously some pots of funds that the state controls, the governor's fund and the 10% of the funds sent to the SEA under the elementary and secondary funds that can be used for additional expenditure, can be used for incentive. But the funds, 90% that flow to districts, really should be in the authority of the districts. Having said that, there's complexities around things like supplement, not supplant, and maintenance of effort. Right now, under the law, states have to maintain their level of spending, but there's an emergency authority to potentially waive that has been put in the hands of the secretary upon state request as things move forward. So right now, the district should have significant flexibility of those funds. Again, some depends on the way states and districts are governed as a matter of state law, but the interplay could become more complicated over time. Sean, maybe to keep monitoring the questions, and while we do that, start to get into a couple of other CARES Act slide issues, because I think some of the questions will be there. Sean?
Great. Before we do that, I just wanted to raise up one question about the idea of if distance learning needs to continue in the fall, and I really appreciate this question because one, it's largely likely that there's going to need to be some form of distance learning either in the fall or even in the winter if we see continued spikes of the outbreak of the virus. But the question is if there are estimates about how many students may not be reached due to equity or to access. And there's definitely some figures that are coming out based on the spring, and that we saw high levels of variation, and particularly for students that reside in low-income communities or low-income districts. that access to those remote learnings is definitely lower than others. There are a couple complications, or a couple, I should say, compounding variables that went into access. A number of districts weren't uniform in their guidance to schools about what constitutes needed remote learning opportunities, but there definitely will continue to be access and equity concerns going into the fall, when we know that we're going to need some variation or some version of remote learning. So I just wanted to highlight that, Scott, but I'll turn it back over to you.
No, that's great, and I'm trying to both monitor folks, the questions and comments as we keep the conversation going, and what will automatically come up later. Please bear with us as we try to navigate that. One other question I see here that I'll address now is the question of, is there guidance on, or will there be likely any national guidance on the efforts around reopening and the various hybrid options that will need to be in place in different circumstances? I will say, we're seeing a large number of state models and guidance emerge on this question that is providing interesting variability, and some crosswalk is being done about what have different states said about their criteria and their models and their options. Of course, on the health side, there's some things out of CDC and national organizations, but I haven't seen something from the federal government per se, but I do think those state pieces are in many places quite comprehensive, and if you haven't looked at those, I would encourage you to do so. Some come to mind, include California, Tennessee, but I'm sure I'm forgetting a large number that are available. Let me keep going a little bit on CARES, and then we'll turn to what's going to happen in the future, because a lot of the questions are about what the likelihood for additional funding is, and I think that's really absolutely critical and right. And then I appreciate that we have one question about the Supreme Court's decision today, which, putting on my legal hat, I also think is very important. So as we look now to CARES Act, from what's in the statute to implementation and where it stands, a few things we need to know. So as Sean said, all states and territories have now applied, and we think been granted both the elementary and secondary and the governor's funds. Doesn't mean they've been distributed, and certainly have not been spent, but are available. In addition, as was mentioned, there are emergency waivers under the Act that allowed the Secretary, upon state request, to pause for this year state assessments, state accountability systems, state data reporting. All states have now applied for and have been approved by those waivers, which we think is also significant. The Secretary was invited, but chose not to seek additional authority to waive key IDA provisions, which will obviously apply differently in the current context, but remain in place for students with disabilities. Let's go to the next slide. There are a couple of other programs we're thinking about. One is a discretionary program that the Secretary has put out for state application around, quote, rethinking education programs. She's chosen to focus on some remote learning options and career and technical education. So those remain other funds that some places are competing for. Again, most of the funds under the CARES Act flow through Title I to states and districts, specifically under the elementary and secondary funding stream. Someone asked about funds particularly for rural districts. Obviously, they would flow in that Title I formula, but I will say the needs of rural districts have been discussed both in the administration and in Congress, and we can expect that in next rounds of funding, if they are present, that kind of distribution across the nation will be a priority. There's also really important guidance and regulations emerging around a couple of other issues. One involves so-called equitable services, which is a long-standing requirement under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that as Title I funds flow for students in poverty, that those funds should be available to support students in poverty who are in private schools as well as public schools. And in what has become a very heated debate, the Secretary held first in guidance and now in an interim rule that was released last week that those funds should be made available equitably to private schools, not just for kids in poverty, but for all kids in private schools, in a very different distribution of funds. The interim final rule released last week, which is complicated because it is final on an emergency basis and therefore is in effect, but it is also out for comment in 30 days and subject to change and potentially judicial challenge as well, provided two courses of action for districts. One is If they choose to use all of the relevant portions of CARES Act funds to serve Title I eligible students, students in poverty, then they can treat private school students similarly and target those funds to students in poverty. But if they choose to use any funds for broader purposes, more systemic purposes, then they need to provide equitable services and those funds distributed based on a ratio of all kids that are served in private schools. This has been met with a lot of real-time pushback by district leaders and others, and remains a open issue in various ways. The other rule that was issued concerned eligibility, particularly though not exclusively in higher education, for funds, particularly for students in the DACA program or other international students, and the holding there was that they are not eligible for relief funds. Again, this may also be subject to challenge. So I don't want to get too in the weeds, but some really important unresolved issues that will have real implications for how districts think about how to use those funds and what they might need to do with them. Let's go to the next slide as we monitor some questions as well. I'm going to pause there and just look, or Sean, turn to you for any questions on the CARES Act itself and invite them through the course of this discussion. And then we'll turn to the question of what might come next as we move from this initial response. Remember, not to minimize $13 to $16 billion, but in the broader scheme of the current crisis and a $2.5 trillion bill, relatively not a significant investment in the education side, and the conversations about what comes next may be far greater. But Sean, is there anything in the Q&A that around the CARES Act itself that we want to address quickly before we move on?
I'm monitoring this, which I really appreciate all of the questions that have come up so far. I will just say, I'll highlight a couple of things. One, the CARES Act does include the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. Scott's mention of some action by the U.S. Department of Education and about limiting access to undocumented international students for some of that funding is a part of that fund. So yes, this does include the Higher Education Relief Fund, and we're happy to answer specific questions that you may have about that. We've been focusing mostly for this conversation so far about K through 12. Another one is just that in terms of student funding for connectivity in order to provide access to devices or to internet, that was not included in the CARES Act. There have been bills proposed since then that would address what we consider the homework gap or the digital divide, but that was not explicit within the CARES Act itself. However, districts can use funding in the CARES Act to purchase devices for students. It's been a little unclear if devices would include like Wi-Fi hotspots to provide internet access. That's been a little unclear, but in terms of the actual connectivity and the homework gap, to support that, additional bills have been proposed, but not explicitly within the CARES Act.
And I think that's debated moving forward. So let me take that opportunity to move us to what might happen next and keep the conversations going. As Sean said, addressing the technology gap is an allowable use under current funds that were provided, but what they did not do was look at E-rate or other things to expressly try to address or eliminate that digital divide directly. Maybe something that is done going forward as the call for that increases. So now the question is, what might come next? And obviously, unlike the rapid bipartisan support for early action around the COVID crisis, the question of additional action on recovery has been more highly political, particularly again in a presidential election and potentially transition year. In the House, the Democratic leadership passed in May a sort of marker bill that would have put an additional $3 trillion in relief through to states and locals, including districts, including not only $90 billion directly for education, but a much larger state and local relief fund that would have also been spent considerably on education, given where state and local funds go. To answer a question in the chat in this regard about what's the likelihood of future funding also being flexible, it was interesting here that even the Democratic bill maintained this notion of fiscal stabilization funds and funds for states and districts, and did not push them through as much existing programs. And so, again, even the Democratic marker bill seems to maintain this flexibility. We'd expect a Republican bill to do the same. And so I think that seems to be directionally maintained. Republicans in the White House denounced that initial Democratic bill, but at the same time called for, more recently, additional investment somewhere between $1 trillion and $2 trillion based in COVID. And right now, the latest is that those debates and those conversations could start as early as July. Various education advocacy groups have come together talking about what the need is, as Sean laid out earlier, from early childhood to K-12 to higher ed, and have called for investments upwards of $250 billion or more for additional education relief. So I think what's most important to look forward is it is highly likely that there will be serious debate and consideration of an additional recovery package. It is likely that we will see an additional recovery package either this summer or as we get into the fall. And it could be even larger than the CARES Act. In fact, it would likely be. And so a big question is, how do we inform that? How do we work toward that? If you go to the next slide, we'll give a little more detail on that in color, and then we'll come back to some additional questions. Again, I mentioned the Democrats and their initial targeted package. In addition, as Sean said, there's a growing interest in trying to make sure that we do something to address the great challenge with regard to access to quality child care and early childhood education at this moment. And so there's a call there and some both partisan and bipartisan bills for significant new investment. On the Republican side, Senator Alexander, the outgoing chair of the Education Committee, has expressed interest in support for significant additional education investment. Senator McConnell and the White House have at least leaked numbers and interests at high levels, and so we certainly expect these conversations to be happening and some movement to occur. Let me go to the last slide in this section, and then maybe Sean will come back. Let me pause there. We'll talk a little bit about then what might we need from the field in order to both inform how these funds are used and what might be needed. Again, not in any way as a call to action, but just to inform folks about how they're thinking about the current moment. But let me see if we can look at the questions for a moment. Sean, do you have any that you want to address before we move on?
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight one to clarify about the flow of funding, particularly for the K-12 relief funds. So the funding that is determined or calculated for each district is based off of Title I calculations. It's an easy formula for the federal government to quickly get funding into districts, and so districts will be receiving funding. I think we've calculated it closely to about 80% of their previous year's Title I funding when you think about a district-by-district breakdown. However, that funding is not purely for Title I's purposes. As we outlined before, that the CARES Act includes a high level of authority for districts to choose how to use that funding, not just for Title I purposes. The complication of that is then when we consider the equitable services share for private school students, and we're still determining how districts may abide by one of those two options in comparison to the rest of the allowable uses for CARES Act. But I just wanted to clarify that the CARES Act funding is not through Title I programs, only through Title I formula.
And to make sure we're addressing this last question even more clearly, districts have significant flexibility in terms of what schools or what students they spend on once it gets to the district level. The funds were not directed down to Title I school or students. Sorry to repeat you, Sean, but just to be clear. But again, this new equitable services rule creates this really strange complication that if therefore a district chooses to target only kids in poverty under Title I, then equitable services for private school students can be similarly limited to students in poverty in private schools. But under the department's new rule released just this week, I believe, at least as it currently stands, if the district chooses to use any funds for broader purposes that are not directed at Title I students, then they must provide equitable services based on the total population of private schools. Again, I think this, my own opinion, don't take this as direct legal advice, but is that runs really inconsistent with the flexibility inherent in the Act and creates a really strange all or nothing decision. And so my guess is you will see a lot of comments and potentially judicial challenges, but it does complicate things in the interim at the district level. At the same time, it does reinforce the interest on focusing particularly on the needs of kids in poverty. So we're all trying to learn more to see how this plays out. One other thing about the look forward in terms of what could happen next in additional federal funding. The investment at the last Great Recession in education was far greater than what has been in the CARES Act to date. Even the spending to avoid potentially great layoffs in among teachers and leaders based on budget shortfalls was significantly greater. And I think this is in part what is informing and driving the belief that the federal government may need to do more. The budget shortfalls we're seeing in terms of state and local projections, again, varying widely. We've seen as much as 20 to 30% budget shortfalls projected. This would have huge implications on education systems, and I hope and believe that that's part of what's informing the potential for federal action. So again, what can you do now if you're a state or a local leader or a teacher or a principal, knowing these funds are coming? And I should say, that the video and audio of this presentation and the deck will be made available on the web. And so if folks want to see the slides, or as some people requested in the chat, the references of where the information comes from, we'll make those available as well. But it is also, as Sean said, completely knowable how much money each state and each district is getting under the different funding sources, and we can make those links available as well. So thinking about what are the most critical needs, how would you want those funds to be spent in your jurisdiction? How can you do it in a way that not only spends those direct funds, but leverages the fullness of the funds that are available to the state, to the local, that are already existing to have the greatest aggregate impact? Again, looking back to that March 13th trigger date and looking forward as we continue to deal with this crisis. And then I think tracking and informing the discourse as early as possible of what other needs arise could be critically important. Sean, let me ask, what do we have next in terms of the slide presentation?
We would love to just continue to take any additional questions that we may have. I think we've got time for 2 or 3 more before we need to wrap up. While we're waiting for some questions to come in, there was a question about uses for higher education funding. I'm not going to go into terrible detail here, just given time, but I'll say institutions that received funding for higher education institutions that received funding, half of that funding must have been used for emergency student grants who were facing unexpected costs due to the pandemic, due to needing to go back home, to continue to pay for housing or childcare or access to technology. For funding that can be used for institutional supports, a number of institutions have used that funding to reimburse themselves for any refunds that they may have given for room and board back to students since they were no longer providing those services. So the availability or the use of funding was less wide for higher education because it was very focused on the relief to students compared to the compared to the K-12 relief fund.
And I'll add some very around, can the funds be used for after school programs? Yes, absolutely. What about preschool funding? There was some additional preschool funding in the Act around the Child Care Development Block Grant and Head Start, but I think it was woefully less than what is needed, and so I think a very active debate and funding going forward. Finally, I want to honor the question that came in as we invite others around the Supreme Court's decision today. I won't go into too much depth because it's not directly on topic, but I'll flag that by a 5-4 opinion today, the Supreme Court in the Espinoza case found that Montana law or the application of its constitutional prohibition around public funding for religious schools violated the free exercise clause. I think this could have wide implications around issues of private school choice. One operative quote in the Supreme Court's decision reads, quote, "A state need not subsidize private education, but once a state decides to do so, it cannot disqualify some private schools solely because they are religious." So I think this will have a lot of ripple effects on those many, many states that have state constitutional prohibitions. And again, we're just beginning to digest that decision, but a little bit of a separate topic from what's being discussed today, although as we heard, the issue for how CARES Act and federal funds flow to private schools is very much a living issue, and so ironically, these things may intersect.
Additionally, to take a very side turn from that, Scott, but thank you for that. There was a question about funding being used for COVID testing when schools reconvene and reopen in the fall. We know testing plans and testing procedures are going to be a significant part of what a fall reopening looks like. I will note that the CARES funding for schools and for districts is not used for testing. That would go through a separate funding stream, not for education programs. But schools and districts can use their CARE funding for personal protective equipment that may be necessary for other procedures and protocols that would need to be put into place in the training that is required for those in order to maintain the health, safety, and well-being of their staff, faculty, and students. So funding can be used for kind of the secondary costs related to the health aspect of the pandemic, but for testing itself, that would not be funding used for schools.
Well, let me just say it's clearly allowable uses, so appreciate, Sean, that distinction, although there are other provisions in the CARES Act that were meant to get at federal support for testing, and happy to look into those with greater detail. We're coming up on time, but let us use better waiting patience than I usually have, Sean, and you are much better as a former teacher, and just give folks a chance to think and ask any additional questions or comments that they might have in the Q&A.
And while folks are doing that, I just wanted to flag that we have definitely a majority of this content that's been captured in written form through our blog and publication with the Wallace Foundation that can be found on their website. There was a question about an FAQ sheet based on this content, so I'll just direct everyone to that publication that we've already published with the Wallace Foundation that can be found on their website. Additionally, this will be presented and published on both of our websites, and we are more than happy to continue to take questions offline too if folks have those as they continue to think about these issues.
Great. Continue questions about specific uses, and again, happy to field some of these offline and make the full list of allowable uses available. What about purchasing technology for teacher and principal evaluation support? So certainly for technology, for teaching and leading schools, the question of evaluation support seems a little removed from current crisis, but I will tell you that the law expressly allows you to pay for any activities authorized under an array of other federal laws, including ESSA as a whole. And so while please don't take this as specific legal advice, my sense is it probably would be allowable under the broad scope of authority that states and locals have under all of those other federal laws. I see a question here also about, oh, just faded away there, sorry, around a national nonprofit focused on eliminating the K-3 summer reading slot. First of all, thank you for doing that. What sources are available and resources available on the Wallace Foundation site, or where our resources could be placed? I will say Wallace, I think, runs an incredible hub for evidence-based resources and research. I don't know how much of that is for outside placement versus curated placement, but we'll certainly invite Kenneth to speak to that as he comes back on. But if folks have not visited the Wallace website as a place for really interesting research, would encourage you to do so.
Additionally, Scott, I've seen this question come up a couple of times about are there any exemplar practices from states and how they may be distributing their funding to districts or supporting their districts and utilizing funds. And I will say immediately, none initially come to mind. I think we're still doing an analysis and an interrogation of how states are responding to this, including their reopening plans and how districts are expected to use their funding. Just, I believe last week, the U.S. Department of Education published all of the state applications for the K-12 Relief Fund. And so we are starting to do some looks into that, as well as a number of other advocacy and think tank organizations that are doing that. So to quickly answer, not yet, but we're hoping that we can soon find those exemplar practices or those kind of spotlight opportunities for how districts and states are using their funding to respond and to think ahead to fall reopening.
And I think this is all becoming much more transparent very quickly. Again, it's interesting to see a number of other questions about allowable uses. One about mental health services, I believe, absolutely a recognized allowable use. Another around university science outreach and visitation programs, again, not directly, I think, easily listed within the specific allowable uses, but again, the law maximizes flexibility. It provides allowable use for any activity authorized by an array of laws, from ESSA to IDEA to CTE laws. And so I think if there's something that really makes sense for your particular district that's an essential need at this moment, I would encourage you to work with your general counsel and look at the full breadth of authority, because it's quite broad, is perhaps the first thing to take from this. Okay. I hope that folks will, this hasn't only been helpful in having you digest a little bit on what is in the four corners of the CARES Act and what money is going to flow. And again, those funds are known and knowable now down to the state and local level, even if they haven't yet reached the wide allowable uses for this initial response to COVID, the availability, not just for funds that have been, or costs that have been incurred to date, but as we move through the summer and into the fall, but also the likely insufficiency of that level of investment and the likelihood of an additional larger investment in recovery that may be coming soon. It could happen in July very quickly with bipartisan support. After that, as Congress tends to go off for the summer, it could happen again in early fall ahead of presidential, and it could also be something that's bound up in the presidential election and is debated in transition or early next year. The length of this crisis and how long it will be with us is obviously difficult to foresee, but our best estimate is that we are not done yet, obviously, unfortunately, with the crisis or with the federal response.
Scott, and I think just to wrap up before we pass it back over to Kenneth for his closing remarks, is just to bring it also full circle to some of the information and data that we shared at the beginning, and thinking about how schools and districts continue to respond. But thinking of that, this moment calls on us to particularly pay close attention to the needs and the equity concerns for districts and the communities that have been so disparately impacted by this pandemic, and the obligation that districts and states have to attending to those needs in particular is something that we definitely want to highlight and advocate for as well.
Thank you all very much. And Kenneth, with just a few minutes left, I think we're going to turn it back to you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Scott and Sean, for what really was a very informative presentation. I want to also just alert, if you haven't looked in your chat box there, we did send a link to the blog post that was referenced, and that is www.wallacefoundation.org/news and media blog pages, the CARES Act. Someone noted that they've only used Wallace for its logic model. Know that we're trying to be very responsive to the on some of the on the ground needs of not just our grantees but to the field at large. And so we do have a number of resources that can be found there. So please feel free to do that. We also have a Facebook page, and we would like to make sure that folks know that they can go on and post questions or thoughts also on the Facebook page about CARES Act or other things as well, depending on the topic. So know that those resources are there. At a recent congressional hearing, John King, Jr., who's the former Secretary of Education, noted that our education system is fraught with inequities that existed before COVID-19, and he added that COVID-19 has exacerbated these educational disparities. Responding to the needs, as you've noted in your chat and Q&A responses, and as Sean and Scott have mentioned, it's really a daunting challenge because clearly, even with these additional trillions of dollars, there's still just not enough to go around. And we don't even know how long this crisis is going to last, as Scott mentioned. But the greater awareness of inequity that the pandemic and the recent protests have revealed also presents an opportunity to make progress. Our hope is that what you have heard today will be helpful toward that end. And let me close by noting, as the historian John Meacham has observed in his book, The Soul of America, progress never occurs in a straight line. But he concludes that for all of our darker impulses, for all of our shortcomings, and for all of the dreams denied and deferred, the experiment begun so long ago, carried out so imperfectly, is worth the fight. In that spirit, we wish you good health, good luck, and thank you again for joining us today. Bye-bye.